In Walker County, Alabama, several jailers are facing federal charges after the death of Tony Mitchell, who was held for nearly 2 weeks in a concrete cell known as the freezer at the Walker County Jail. The medical examiner says he froze to death. Meanwhile, Sheriff Nick Smith denies any wrongdoing and is seeking reelection. What happened to Tony Mitchell inside cell BK5? Hello and welcome to USA Today's The Excerpt. I'm Dana Taylor. Joining me to discuss why jailers in Walker County are facing civil rights charges are USA Today national extremism reporter Will Carless and USA Today investigative reporter Gina Barton, who investigated Mitchell's death and the jail. Gina and Will, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for having me.
Will, I mentioned the cement cell where Mitchell froze to death, BK5, also known as the freezer. Describe this cell for me and what the conditions were like during the 14 days that led up to his death.
Yeah, so I visited Walker County back in December, around about the same time as this horrendous incident took place. And it was chilly, it was very cold. And really the cell is just sort of through one doorway from the Sally Port where they bring people in handcuffs and people who are, who need to be incarcerated. And it's just a bare room. Picture a cube of concrete. That's essentially what it is. Now, it's no longer used as a cell. It's now used for storage and the door is propped open. But of course, it was very different 3 years ago when Tony Mitchell died there.
And what can you tell me about the man who ran and is still running the jail where Tony Mitchell was being held, Sheriff Nick Smith?
So this is really just an extraordinary story of a sheriff that can just hang on. I mean, this man has seen so many members of his department charged with serious federal civil rights charges, a big sprawling DOJ investigation into the way that he ran his jail. And he's still there. He hasn't been charged. He hasn't stepped down. He's running for re-election this spring and widely expected to probably win if he isn't charged in the meantime. But the kind of gist of this story is about how difficult it is to remove a sitting sheriff, even when really grotesque and unimaginable things happen under their watch.
Well, Gina, as Will said, Sheriff Smith hasn't been charged for Mitchell's death. Could there still be charges brought against him? So far, has he been punished in any way?
The federal case is proceeding the way a lot of federal cases do, where they tend to charge the underlings and then get them to flip and provide information or testify against the higher-ups. So that seems to be proceeding toward possibly an indictment of Sheriff Smith, although you never know for sure. And in these types of cases, the supervisor of the people who violated Tony Mitchell's civil rights, supervisors can be charged for things like failure to intervene if they knew what was happening, could have stopped it, and failed to stop it. And Sheriff Smith says he didn't know. So the big question is, will the federal prosecutors be able to prove he knew what was happening just downstairs from his office in that jail? Now, locally, the district attorney has charged Sheriff Smith with several misdemeanors for hiring unqualified people, not the people who were involved in Tony Mitchell's death, but other people, some of them school resource officers. So he's fighting those misdemeanor charges. But in Alabama, a misdemeanor cannot get you removed as a sheriff. And then also, the state board has voted to decertify him as a police officer, as a law enforcement officer in Alabama. But again, they tell me that in that state, you don't need certification in order to serve as a sheriff. So it certainly appears that the only thing that could drive him from office would be losing the election or being convicted of a felony.
Gina, Mitchell's death isn't the only incident of neglect and violence levied against Walker County Jail. You shared some jarring examples in your story. What else has taken place in this jail?
In many of the court records that I looked at, including the federal criminal charges against some of the jailers and some of their plea agreements, some civil suits, there were a lot of problems happening in the Walker County Jail. There was one instance where a man walked out an open door, and when they caught him, a bunch of jailers just beat him back inside the jail to the point where one of the guy's uniform pants was just full of this prisoner's blood. There was another allegation that some jailers enlisted a prisoner to serve as an enforcer and to kind of try to keep the other prisoners in line. And as part of that, he beat up a young teenage inmate. And then these jailers wrote a letter to the judge who was going to sentence this enforcer and said, he's a model inmate with no signs of aggression whatsoever. So those are just a couple of examples, but clearly there were some issues with how people were being treated inside that jail.
Gina, there's a common thread through some of those cases, and that's mental illness, which you described as being a death sentence. Can you give me some background into what led to the arrest of Tony Mitchell?
Tony Mitchell, up until young adulthood, was just your average, happy guy, 6'5", played basketball, lived in poverty with his family, but his sister said that, he was just a really good big brother and they had the kind of issues that any family would have. But then later in life, he fell victim to what so many families in Appalachia and in Walker County have fallen victim to, which is drug abuse. The opioid crisis hit Walker County really hard, and Tony Mitchell found himself addicted to drugs. And the theory is that his drug use led to some sort of mental collapse. And so he, in January of 2023, called his cousin Steve and told his cousin Steve that the house where he was living had portals to heaven and hell opening up in it. And he wanted Steve's help to get the remains of his stillborn brother, who was stillborn in 1984, out of this wall. He wanted to knock down a wall, get this box of remains, put it in the portal to heaven. And so, understandably, Steve was scared and worried about Tony's well-being. And so eventually, the Walker County Sheriff's Department was called out, and there were some allegations that Tony fired a shot toward them before he ran into the woods trying to get away from these police officers. Who knows what he was thinking at that point. They caught him, and then as they were taking him to the squad car, they said he stiffened. So I don't know if he had a seizure, but they said his body stiffened. And at that point, one of the deputies threw him on the ground or dropped him onto the ground, stomped on his genitals and said, "This is how we deal with seizures in Walker County." And then put him in the squad car, took him off to that jail cell that Will was talking about earlier. And in that cell, he was wearing what's called a suicide smock, so not even a full pants and shirt. And then as our investigation showed, as time went on, they even took that away. And they took away his sleeping mat. He had no blankets. And he was basically naked and cold in that cell, depending on the deputies for water, for trips to the toilet, for showers. And for much of the time he was there, he did not receive any of those things.
Well, members of Mitchell's family were relieved when he was arrested. They see his arrest as a necessary intervention. And if so, why are they suing?
Well, initially, that's how they saw it. They thought, look, he needs help. At least he's somewhere safe and secure where he's going to detox, and it's not going to be a nice experience, but at least he's safe. At least he's going to be fed and watered and taken care of. That's how they felt. This is a poor family. They don't have money to send him to some fancy rehab or something like that. I mean, the reality in a lot of kind of rural America and urban America is that the rehab, the sort of de facto rehab, is the local jail, right? It's the holding tanks. And so that's what they thought was happening. And of course, what was happening was something far more disturbing. And I do think it's important to note, I mean, both Gina and I have been doing this job for a long time. We've read a lot of awful stories and seen a lot of horrible accounts of, and we hear about mistreatment in jails all the time. But this is more than that. This was 2 weeks of willful negligence and abuse. And so why are they suing? Well, they're suing because a loved member of their family who they thought was safe and was being taken care of was in fact being very clearly mistreated, to the point that people are now serving or about to serve prison sentences as a result of the crimes that they committed in his treatment. So they've sued, they've settled, they have won the settlement, they won the case. That civil suit's no longer pending, but now it's just the criminal case that's working through.
Well, despite being stripped of his law enforcement certification, Sheriff Smith is now cruising towards reelection. What are the power dynamics still at work in Walker County, Alabama, that seem to be benefiting Sheriff Smith?
One of our sources told Gina that getting rid of a sheriff in Alabama is like deposing a king, right? It's like these people are all powerful. I mean, he's the kind of the apex predator, if you like, of law enforcement. He's practically untouchable. So the power dynamics are that he's extraordinarily powerful. He gets to control much of the messaging. He has the funding that come with his department. He's able to raise money, and he's able to put out a message of, just like any politician, a message of control and power and everything else. And he's been very successful at that. Look, I mean, I met with Nick Smith in person. I spent time with him, and he's a very nice, friendly, charming guy, and he is able to portray that and keep that image afloat. And that's what he continues to do. I'm not sure that he's sailing to victory. There's a lot of critics of him in Walker County. He thinks he's going to win. He's won the last two elections, but whether he wins this one or whether he ends up being charged before the election remains to be seen.
He's defended the work he's done as sheriff in transforming the Walker County Jail. What did he share with you about that?
Sheriff Smith essentially has two defenses to what happened to Tony Mitchell and to these other individuals that were mistreated by members of the Walker County Sheriff's Department. The first one is that, look, since Mitchell's death, he has fought for money and fought for investment to really kind of clean up the jail. He says that he inherited a jail which, his words, he described as sort of third world conditions. It was, and he showed me photographs of it. I mean, this was a very dilapidated building with sort of everything from missing light fixtures to broken toilets to just graffiti everywhere. And I walked around it, and these days it is in much better condition. It's much cleaner. It's much more organized, at least the day that I was there, right? And they've installed things like heart monitors in the cells, in the holding cells. And he says they've installed a whole bunch more cameras to kind of keep an eye on people. That's his first line of defense. His second line of defense is a more extraordinary one for anyone who knows anything about law enforcement. And it essentially boils down to the rules in this county and in this state force me to hire people who aren't very good at their jobs, is essentially what it boils down to. And he says, look, because of these rules and regulations, I end up hiring people who, if I had my way, wouldn't be working for us. And that's what he points to as sort of the reason for how things got so out of control and Tony Mitchell ended up dying. So those two excuses are what he points to. He says, look, both of those things are to some extent out of my hands. Says he was fighting for the money to rejuvenate the prison long before this horrendous incident happened. And says, look, I've been trying to change the rules on hiring and they won't let me, is essentially what his defense boils down to. In addition, of course, to, look, I wasn't there. I wasn't dealing with him personally. I was just kind of overseeing the jail. That's how he's defended himself.
Gina, what's next for the Mitchell case, and what's next for Walker County Jail and its sheriff, Nick Smith?
Well, right now, the federal case is proceeding, and there have been 24 people charged with violating the civil rights of Tony Mitchell and other prisoners there. So that case is proceeding. Things take a long time in federal court. I covered it for many years. And so it could be another year or even two before that case is concluded. So that case is moving ahead. We'll see if anyone actually is able to give the FBI and the prosecutors the evidence that they would need to charge Nick Smith. And whether or not that happens, the primary for the sheriff's election is in May. And in Walker County, it's a Republican stronghold. So basically, whoever wins that primary will be the victor in the general election later this year. So that's what everybody is waiting to see. Will people reelect him or not? And if he is reelected, or even if he isn't reelected, will he be charged with anything? Will he have to face any accountability for this?
Powerful investigative reporting here. Will Carless is a national extremism correspondent, and Gina Barton is an investigative reporter for USA Today. Gina and Will, thank you both so much for being on the Excerpt.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Dana.
Thanks for watching. I'm Dana Taylor. I'll see you next time.